Hello everyone, you can call me Freebiewits, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Analyse and Adapt Season 2, where I see if a TV series would work in 3 different mediums. Tabletop as in board and card games, tabletop roleplay like Dungeons and Dragons, and finally as a LARP. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. These little things really do help the channel. Today we're taking a look at Danmachi. Now before we begin, note that I'm playing Hades and I am at the endgame, so there are some story-based spoilers here and there. So if you want to keep supporting this video while avoiding the Hades spoilers, please just minimize the video and continue listening to the sound of my voice. For those of you who don't know, Danmachi, or Is It Wrong to Pick Up Girls in a Dungeon, is a bit of a mouthful, which is why we're calling it Danmachi, or Danmachi. I'm not entirely sure how it's pronounced. Anyways, Danmachi was originally a popular light novel, and like many light novels with both fan service and action scenes, it was eventually turned into an anime. The show follows the adventures of one Bel Cranel and his quest to become a hero. As far as fantasy-based shows go, it's fairly stock standard. There's an earnest protagonist with lots of potential who starts out weak, lots of potential love interests, and a dungeon filled with monsters that have a clear line of progression and difficulty. One of the things that make the series a bit more unique is the fact that the gods aren't just real, but they're walking among the mortals in a depowered state. They aren't mysterious nondescript entities occasionally granting blessings and like, they're actual characters. From this depowered state, they can empower people in their familiar, their guilds in other words, and make them stronger and level up, almost gamifying the whole process. As characters, they can also offer fan service, comedy bits, dialogue, all that stuff. They're, like I said, actual characters. Bel's goddess is Hestia, goddess of the hearth, and while he begins as the only member, he slowly but surely helps build up the familiar into a real fighting force. Now with that out of the way, let's see if we can turn Danmachi into a god-like tabletop game. And no, I will not apologize for the pun no matter how many times it gets used. Danmachi as a game is convenient in that it has a scaling level of difficulty and a clear path of progression built into the setting itself. The lower you go into the dungeon, the more dangerous the monsters get, and the more treasures you can loot. In that regard, I figure we can make it a risk versus reward style game, almost like playing chicken, similar to blackjack in the way that you can either hit or stay, all that sort of things. Because of this, I suggest we play as the gods/goddesses instead of the individual adventurers who would be making the trek down into the dungeons. Gameplay, in my mind, would play very much like Lords of Waterdeep, where you can collect adventurers of all types and send them off on the various quests. Different gods and goddesses would of course have different abilities, all themed around their characters in the anime. Hestia would always have access to one adventurer to represent the undying loyalty of Bel. Hephaestus, being all about smithing, would reduce the requirements for certain crafting quests, and Ishtar would have the ability to make money off her idol heroes as they, how do I put this in a PG way? Work side jobs for her. Yeah, let's go with that, side jobs. After a certain amount of turns, the game would end. To determine who is the winner, we'd look at who completed the most quests, has the most gold, and leftover adventurers. With that sort of system, however, there is one downside. Everyone can see who is going to win. At a certain point in the game, sometimes players might decide to gang up on each other to give themselves a better chance at victory, but other times you're so far behind that there's no point. Lords of Waterdeep manages to avoid this for the most part as it's designed by a big group of, well, people who make it their jobs to design this sort of thing. As I'm just a single guy on YouTube, well, I'm going to cheat and suggest the final dungeon run as a band-aid to this issue. So what is this final dungeon run? In my mind, anyone can attempt a normal dungeon run at any time, for riches and glory. However, getting to the bottom and beating the final boss, however, would win you the entire game straight away. Now, that said, with such a clear win condition, it would be insanely difficult to even try, and you'd have to sacrifice so many resources and other opportunities to even attempt it. If you find yourself in the position to ever beat the final dungeon, then it most likely means you're winning already anyways. No need to risk your adventurers and resources on what could end in devastating defeat. You could, in theory, end up as a god/goddess without any adventurers, gold, or any other ways to recruit them. And at that point, you're really screwed. So, throwing people into the grinder, as it were, could just make a losing player lose even more now I think about it. So how does Lords of Waterdeep help alleviate this winners only win harder sort of gameplay? And in my mind, it helps alleviate it with random events, which fits into Danmachi perfectly. Perhaps there's a sudden monster attack on the surface, cutting off access to certain buildings and resources until it's defeated. Perhaps two guilds have to go to war with each other. Actually, now that I think about it, the war thing could be a normal part of gameplay without any random influences whatsoever. A player, in theory, could challenge another to a war game and put certain resources on the line. However, just like any challenge, it can be refused. To stop people from constantly refusing or constantly issuing challenges, we'd have to make them only work in certain circumstances. Regardless, a more in-depth list of rules would be impractical to try and flesh out, so let's just ignore it for now and skip to a more roleplay-oriented medium. That is, tabletop RPGs. As far as I'm aware, everyone who plays tabletop roleplay games are religious. They may not believe in the Christian God or anything like that, but I've seen everyone, no matter if they're an atheist or not, pray to the dice gods. So adding gods into a game isn't anything new to them. Anyways, Danmachi is convenient in that it has a home base for the players to return to. I've covered the advantages of this for tabletop RPGs before, so I'll only do a quick recap rather than a full-blown explanation like last time. To summarize, it gives a place for the players to customize and return to, grounding the whole experience. Besides the base, Danmachi also has gods who are in charge of the players. The level of their bossiness and need for control varies from god to god. Some of them are very controlling, micromanaging buttfaces, while others are so hands-off that they're only in charge of everyone in name only. Point is, the GM can control the guiding authority on the adventurers' lives and create what I like to call a soft railroad. My views on this have already been explained in previous videos, so let's move on. The other thing that would make Danmachi unique in the tabletop RPG world is the fact that the characters actually know about their stats, and that leveling up is a genuine thing in-universe. Knowing that you level up isn't meta, it's actually part of the setting. That said, level 6 in this universe is seen as the pinnacle of heroic power that can take an entire lifetime to achieve, and for the majority of adventurers outright impossible to even reach for. Now that's not to say that there's no growth if you don't level up. It's explicitly shown that stats can grow and skills can be gained when their Falna is updated. Falna in this case is more or less the setting's character sheet, which is engraved on the adventurer's back. Said Falna is placed by the god and updated by the god. In other words, to power up, the characters have to return home. So why can't the gods do this while they're mid-adventure in the dungeon? Well, according to the setting, it's because the gods aren't allowed to go into said dungeons. Note that I haven't read the light novel, so all my knowledge is from the first 2 seasons of Danmachi, so I'm not entirely sure if the dungeon itself is a malevolent intelligent entity or on what level it's operating. All I know is that it doesn't like the gods. Regardless, this presents an interesting roleplay opportunity. To level up, or power up more accurately, players have to interact directly with their gods and show their back to them. This can be represented by the players actually handing over their character sheets to be updated by the Game Master. The ultimate show of trust, you could say. Danmachi in that regard would be a game of contrasts. Players would spend long periods of time in the dungeon, fighting and surviving only to return and rest, getting stronger while doing so. They could also spend more time on the surface to buy materials and resources. In fact, the god would probably have their own businesses on the surface, while other NPCs who are under their command form a sort of support structure for the players and heroes. Whenever the players return, something could have changed on the surface. The setting has literally built a city and thus economy around the dungeon. Dungeon delving is a serious business at this point, and like many businesses, it's got structure. With that all said and done, let's move on to Larp. Considering how structured things are like I mentioned above, Danmachi might be one of the easier shows to adapt into a LARP-style game. By default, you have a home base / city, and you have a hostile area where all the monsters and nasty things are. You also have different factions that might oppose each other, but might not always be openly hostile, and you have an inbuilt level up system. What I've just done here is describe a good number of fantasy-based LARPs and how they already operate. Having a god touch your bare back to level up would have to be tweaked, as not everyone would be comfortable with such contact, or even be able to take off their armor comfortably during LARP. But on the surface level, everything else is pretty straightforward. So what other advantages and challenges are there? Well, for one, the gods are a bit of a mixed bag. In many LARPs, having players in a position of power and authority isn't anything new. I myself had served a king and played as a general. What makes this situation unique is the fact that the gods don't really take part in battles for the most part, and are the source of the player's actual powers. Even if the players, out of character, don't directly tinker with their character sheets themselves and instead give all their powers to the organizers, it does introduce some risk in character. If a faction is getting too powerful, then one way of stopping that faction is to take out the god, reducing all the associated players' powers, who are directly attached to that god, down to level 0. Now, a player can still be quick and skillful in their own right, but without levels, if another higher level player can deal more damage per hit, then the scales might be unbalanced from that alone. That, of course, would be the nuclear option in a game. If someone misbehaves and goes for a god, then everyone else might turn on that faction and their god. It turned into a Cold War scenario, which isn't necessarily a bad thing in of itself. It'd be tense, yes, but it could also lead to many heroics and memorable moments too. Then, of course, you have death. Despite having healing magic and literal gods, the setting doesn't seem to have any form of resurrection. In many LARPs where death is permanent but the characters are intended to last a long time, they often have a mechanic where you can't kill someone by accident. If the characters reach 0 hit points, they become unconscious. From there, they can be rescued, captured, or be ransomed off by the enemy, or purposely be killed. Bleeding out is another common mechanic, but we'll not focus on that for now. Because the action of killing has to be so deliberate, it could eventually lead to an unspoken rule. Don't kill our people, because if you do, we'll extend the same courtesy to you and yours. This would only really work with players who are invested in their own character's growth, and chaotic players would have no reason to abide. Hell, they could even play a serial killer and claim that's part of their character too. My point is that Danmachi already has all the ingredients to be a LARP, and indeed, seems to have many elements from existing LARPs, so with a bit of tweaking, I believe it'd work in this specific medium. So that's my analysis of Danmachi and how it can be adapted into 3 different mediums. How do you think it'd work? Have any of you tried adapting any elements of the show yourself, and if so, how did it go? Consider leaving a comment, liking the video, and subscribing. Sharing it would also help the channel. My name is Freebywits, and thank you for watching. Bye bye. So Hephaestus is a dude in Greek mythology, but they're represented as a hot lady in Danmachi. What is with Japan and turning mythological characters into girls anyways? First King Arthur, then Hephaestus, and then Loki? Wait, no, Loki turned into a girl in one of hers original myths anyways. Does that make Japan a copycat of Norse mythology? Does that make Norse mythology the original anime? Huh.